The cloud-native ecosystem, largely centered around Kubernetes and microservices architectures, has taken the industry by storm. As DevOps team rush into this brave new world, they quickly find that there's a need for a new set of instrumentation and tooling primitives. This can be daunting, complex, and without a disciplined, incremental approach, this migration can be doomed to fail. Hello everyone, this is your co-host for the CloudNativeFM podcast. My name is Simon Safdu and you are listening to the CloudNative.fm podcast episode number 18. And today we are talking about DeployHub with my guest Tracy Regan, CEO of DeployHub, and Steve Taylor, CTO of DeployHub. And this is how both of us define DeployHub. DeployHub is your central microservices platform for cataloging, versioning, and deploying microservices consistently all day long. It tracks your logical application versions and dependencies across clusters, reducing the complexity and risk inherent in a microservice architecture. So follow him on more news on microservices, Tracy Regan on Twitter at Tracy Regan, and follow Steve Taylor on Twitter at SBTaylor16. And let's go ahead and cut it over to the interview and say hi to Tracy and Steve Taylor. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is a CloudNative.fm podcast, episode number 18, and I'm your co-host for today's podcast, Simon Safdur, and I'm really excited because this time I am finally joined by the Cloud Native girl or the Microservices girl, and this is the first time I ever have a host that is lady, girl, woman, whatever you call it. And also joined by the guy, Steve. And I'm really excited for today's session. And today we're talking about the microservices at scale with Ortelius and DeployHub. But let me introduce my guest to you. Tracy Regan is CEO from DeployHub, and Steve Taylor is a CTO of DeployHub as well. How are you guys? Can you introduce yourself to my audience? And where are you living right now? And how COVID affects you when you're traveling on a daily basis?
I'll go first. So I am Tracy Regan. I am the CEO of DeployHub. I'm also an active member in the Continuous Delivery Foundation, also known as the CITA. I have served on the board as what they call a board member rep. So all of their members get to vote, and I've been elected now three times, which is an honor. And what we do there is really think about the next iteration of DevOps tooling. And DeployHub has always been a forward-looking company, and we are super focused on simplifying all of the complexities you find in microservices. And COVID hasn't really changed much for me. I have spent a lot of time meeting awesome people like Simon and others who we have met through the Ortelius open source community. So I've taken lemons and made lemonade and done the best I can with creating a community to socialize with via Zoom.
And I'm, go ahead, Simon.
Steve, can you introduce yourself now?
Yeah, so I'm Steve Taylor. I'm the CTO of DeployHub. I've been working in the configuration management, build management space forever. And we saw a need for, when microservices started evolving, to fill a gap that was coming out there. And we'll get into that here pretty detailed. And as far as COVID for my side, I am the chief of our volunteer fire department. So we had to put some new protocols in place, which was pretty interesting when you start transporting people around that have COVID. But luckily, in our state here in New Mexico, we have a very aggressive vaccination plan, so we're actually doing pretty good, and finally starting to get out and be able to be out without masks, which is nice.
Yes, definitely. That's awesome to hear that. Finally, we have a place where people can go outside without wearing a mask. That's wonderful. So I'm really excited today because I start going switch to this Tracy, because this is the first time I ever meet in CloudNative podcast, having a woman besides me. And I just talk a little about, can you introduce two things to my audience? What is, how much microservices is been everybody talking about microservices, containers, Kubernetes, service meshes, we're all talking about these guys. But the first question that people came up there that we are talking about microservices. But we're really right now talking about these kind of things. So can you introduce ourselves to the audience? What is the microservices? Why we need to care? And what are you doing, your guys, in your open source project called DeployHub and your open source community, Ortelius?
So microservices are really the way that you take advantage of a cloud native architecture. We know that a lot of organizations have started moving to containers, where they're containerizing their application, and they run their container in a Kubernetes cluster, which gives them some immediate benefits. Fault tolerance and auto scaling are the two primary ones. But if you think about the auto scaling part of those benefits, when you take a monolithic application and you put it in a container and then you auto scale that, you're auto scaling your monolith. Microservices says, maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe you can break down your application and decouple it, decompose it, and create loosely coupled microservices that then one tiny function can auto scale, which is far more efficient. And if you think about the life cycle, it's efficient. It's more efficient, not just in the auto scaling features of what Cloud Native can bring to you, but it's more efficient in terms of the development pipeline. Instead of always having to rebuild your entire application and do this static linking, what's happening is you're making small changes to the code, and then you do the linking in your runtime environment. Now, the reason why you do that is because it's loosely coupled. So what that allows you to do is take advantage of that auto scaling, as well as some other things. This is the core of what we're starting to address from a DevOps pipeline perspective. Most of the money, most of the time that we have seen spent in a cloud native environment has been around building the infrastructure. Tools like Rancher, HashiCorp and Terraform, this kind of service mesh, these all have to do with the actual physical cluster management. But we have to build applications to run in those clusters. And so now we're starting to see a shift to actually decomposing applications, breaking them up, and trying to manage them through the DevOps pipeline. One of the things that you lose is the concept of an application version. And you also lose this concept of versioning each container. While you have versioned the data in the container, so for example, the code, you don't have a clear understanding of the version of the container. We have a SHA, and that's as far as we know, to make that container unique. So you have basically a microservice configuration management puzzle to solve. That is what we're doing at DeployHub. We took about 80% of the code that we use to do that function, and we open sourced it to the Continuous Delivery Foundation, so other companies can start building upon that. Now, there's two parts of that. There's the versioning and the tracking of the service, but there's also the cataloging, because microservices, their ownership is important, and it's hard to determine their ownership if you don't have a service catalog. So what we've done is we've combined a service catalog that that defines the ownership of a microservice, as well as a platform for versioning and tracking the dependencies across clusters as they relate to the applications that you're creating.
Yes, definitely. I think that's that's a puzzle piece is being, I think, missing it right now in the microservices world, because we have, let's say we have 10,000 or 20,000 of microservices, and everybody talk to each other, and they are independently evolve, deploy, and manage. And you need to make control of what is happening from day 0 to day 1 to day 2 to day n. So I think that's the puzzle that is missing right now. So now let's switch to the Steve. What just Tracy said. Why you think it is so important to version our microservices and have to take control of that? Because people need to think about that. The microservice is there to reduce the complexity and also give you the independence of deploying the configurations and these kind of setting. But yet they often overlook these kind of concepts that Tracy talk about. Why you think is people are not thinking about these kind of things from the day one? They're often thinking about when the application are already deployed in their clusters.
Yeah, so what we've seen is the customers start out, like Tracy said, with a monolith, and then they have just one big giant container, and they're able to use kubectl to deploy that. They're happy, the world is good. And then they start breaking apart or adding on new features that are going to be implemented in microservices. So you have this hybrid of monolith plus the microservices, and they have maybe 10 microservices, and they're still doing it manually. They maybe have a development cluster and a production cluster, and maybe a QA cluster at this point in their maturity model. But what ends up happening is when you start rolling into a fuller microservices world, it goes exponentially, the number of services. And that's where something like Ortelius and versioning the services and bringing those back into a version of the application really makes all the difference in the world. To know what is running in production, what is running in QA, how to compare QA to production. Just to give you an example, if you, like in Ortelius, we have about 130 tables that drive Ortelius. So if you look at a basic CRUD, you know, the create, retrieve, update, delete model, each one of those being a transaction, I have I'll make my math easy, 100 tables. That's 400 transactions, potential transactions I have to manage now. Now, theoretically, each one of those should be a microservice, but you want to join together a few of the pieces. Like what we do is we take all the create, update, and delete, put those in one microservice because they're going to be hit less frequently. And then the retrieve ones are going to be hit more frequently. So that goes into a second service. So in my example, we would typically have 200 microservices. Now you take how many stages of your pipeline. So if we have a dev stage, a QA stage, and a production stage, we have potentially 600 versions of our microservices. And you can't keep track of that in your head. But one of the things that's the beauty of microservices is because they're so small and they have a specific function that they're going to execute, that you can actually get that rock solid and it's not going to break. You know, the chance of its breaking is going to be minimal. And what you'll see is 80% of your code base will become static. And then you have this 15 to 20% that's going to change. I'm not saying that 80% never has a bug in it, but what you're going to see is you're going to have 20%, 15 to 20% of your application is going to be changing more frequently. Business logic needs to be updated, new features, bugs, that type of thing is going to be driving that 20% to change. And when you can get rid of 80% of your code base and kind of ignore it, it makes your development world a lot easier. And it's in being able to understand it, but being able to look at it from a high level. You know, 80% of this is in production, then I want to layer on some changes. that's where it gets more complicated, and that's where Ortelius really drives that view of your applications from the 60,000 foot view down across the organization for an application.
Yes, definitely. I think when I first jump into the cloud native and the microservices space, we think people are talking about the containers, and then people move to the orchestrator because we need to orchestrate container because they are not one, not two, they are millions of containers. I need an orchestration engine that needs to manage and deploy that. And if some of the containers go down, then who has a responsibility to take that up, a new instance of that container and deploy that up? So that's another piece that is missing. Then finally, we see that another piece that is missing in the microservices is observability, security of these microservices, and that people are leveraging service meshes for that. So these are the puzzle pieces already solved right now. But the next puzzle piece that we are missing right now is that some of the things that we did with some three or N-tier or three-layer architecture, let's call domain-driven design, test-driven development, and these kind of things. That is already missing in these kind of space. But when I joined the Ortelius, I think I love their analogy of versioning and tracking their microservices and doing, because that's really vital for everyone, because if you deploy microservices day by day, you need to change and update those microservices independently. That's the advantage of microservices we have. And I think we need some tools for that. And that's, thankfully, people are talking about these kind of concepts, taking seriously these concepts because it's vital to their business. So, so that's a really important thing. So now we jump a little bit about why it's important, why it is. Now I think we start moving about, we have a, let's say we have an N-tier or three-tier architecture. So what people have to say in order to move that in three-tier or N-tier layer architecture to the microservices? Can you, Tracy, draw some points of some best practices that people need to follow if they migrate their N-tier or three-tier architecture to microservices?
Yeah, so one of the things that you need to look at is the transactions, like I was talking about. What are the transactions from, I wouldn't say necessarily from a pure functional view, but more from kind of like the business logic. You know, what is this transaction? What's the purpose of it? And is there something else that we're going to fit into that same category? Let's say a shopping cart for a website. We could have the shopping cart, you know, you can have something to calculate the tax, update the number of items in the shopping cart. Those can all be separate microservices, but in the shopping cart domain. Now, the beauty of the domain-driven design, when we start looking at that way, we can actually start sharing that and collaborating across multiple teams. One of the hard things in microservices that people are still getting stuck on is that this is mine. This is my microservice and you can't have it. And which ends up happening is everybody creates the same microservice over and over and over again. So we end up with all this extra coding, slightly different implementations, different bugs. But if we can get down to really looking at reusable code as microservices as reusable code, we can really then drive that collaboration and that domain-driven design process. Now, when we look at an N-tier level application, the microservices are going to fit into every tier. And one of the things I'm still waiting for, it's kind of out there. Google did some work around Material IO and some of the component widgets. But what I'm waiting for is not only the back end side to have microservices around data access. How do I go get something from a database? How do I aggregate it together, which would be a little more like a middle layer API gateway, and then how do I get that out to the front end, which would be on my web page. But also, because web page is just HTML, we can actually start doing components on the web page. So I could actually have microservices serving up subsets of my web page. So if you look at a dashboard for a stock trading application, you have all these boxes. here's the current positions, here's the market, here's some news articles. Each one of those boxes could be its own component, which could be its own microservice. So I could actually go through and do this plug and play through this microservice-based architecture for not only the back-end side, the middle layer, but also the front-end side. The front-end side is not quite there yet, but it'll get there. I predict that in the next 3 years, the front-end developers will be literally dragging widgets around, and where am I going to put them on a page? So that's kind of where we're headed, and it's very exciting. But to do that, you have to manage every single version, because if you think about the number of widgets on a web page, you're going to go into the thousands easily.
So let me.
Yes, definitely. I think one of the biggest.
Okay, so let me do some summarizing. Steve just gave us a lot of information in that, and some of you may have gotten lost in it. I think what we have to think about in terms of microservices are 3 problem areas: microservice sprawl, microservice drift, and microservice blast radius. And in essence, Steve is talking about those 3 problems that we see with microservices. Let's take the first one really quickly here, microservice sprawl. So when Steve was talking about having, you've got 80% of the microservices that probably are static and 20% that are changing a lot. Well, that's for one application. Now, you may use those foundational microservices across many applications. And depending on at what period of time that application was built out, you may have different versions of those underlying components that create that foundation. That is what we call sprawl. We have many microservices running that do the same thing. They're the same microservice. They're running in different clusters to support different applications. They may even be running in different namespaces, but think about them as being deployed at different places in different parts of the pipeline, dev, test, and prod. Now, sprawl also occurs when you don't have what he talked about, a domain-driven design. When you don't have a domain-driven design, everybody's going to go, and you don't have it organized in solution spaces, and this team's working on the security, and I need a login routine. I need to go look at them and ask them if they have a login routine that I can use. That is the essence of a domain-driven design, but it's often done on paper. So what Ortelius does is it builds a catalog that's based on your domain-driven design, so you understand as a consumer where you can go look for a login routine. And then you can see the version. Now, the drift occurs is when you have those different versions running in the different clusters. And that is a really hard problem, because without versioning the service, you really don't know which version's running out there. Now, there's ways to try to do that with naming. You can try to create different naming standards for every time you create a new image. But is that a different function? What is in it, actually? So when you think about microservices, I know this is a stretch, but think about microservices as pieces of code, because in essence, that's what they are. They are pieces of code that you're pulling together and you're linking at runtime. So in the same way that we have versioned source code for years and years and years, we're now needing to version our source code, but that source code is now a microservice living in a container that you're going to consume and reuse. So this is the reason why versioning is important. In the same way you create a base version of your source code, you need to create a base version of your container, and then we need to track the changes over time. That is what configuration management is. That's the purpose of a domain catalog. That's the purpose of the versioning. And that's one of the reasons why we called the company DeployHub, because we're not GitHub. We are tracking items that are ready to deploy that now are really your pieces of code.
Yes, definitely. I think the point that you try to drive in, because in the microservices world, let's say you are still living in those ages that you have the N-tier or 3-layer architecture, but you end up having the same containerized box and everything is sitting inside that box. Whenever you isolate that your box into the multiple pieces, Now your code is scattered in many other places, and then you link together these different pieces to form a useful app. But you need to track these microservices, because people are talking about, when I have a microservice, might be this microservice used in some else project as well. But with the container or three-layer architecture, you can't use that functionality. But with the microservices, you can use that. For that, you need to track what microservices changes happen for this project A and what changes happen for my project B. So these are the three essential components that we need to start. So let's say if somebody are listening to us and they are absolutely convinced that these are the vital for their business and their values, and now they are wanted to switch to DeployHub and they want to use that. What are the benefits they bring up to you else from versioning and tracking and these kind of stuff? What are the other things that DeployHub provide? And if somebody using the DeployHub, let's say today, what are the other things that they need to learn? Let's say would they need to learn containers, Kubernetes, or is this a DeployHub for some other projects as well? Those are not deployed via Kubernetes. What is the software development life cycle when people are using a DeployHub? Tracy, can you answer these questions?
I'll answer some of them. I'll pass some of them off to Steve. So when you start moving to when you start decomposing your monolith, you really do need to have a way to organize those pieces. That's one of the first benefits that you find with using a service catalog like DeployHub or Ortelius. You have a location for microservice or API developers to register their microservice, register their ownership, tell everybody where the Helm chart is that needs to be used to deploy it or whatever you're using, standardize on the key value pairs so that every time it's moved out to a cluster, it's done exactly the same way. That's one of the first ways to simplify microservices. Once you start doing that and your application teams start consuming those, then you begin tracking at the application level, which is really hard to do outside of a tool like DeployHub or Ortelius, because the application becomes logical. And the application itself changes even though the application team isn't aware that the application changed, right? Because they're consuming external services, and an external service may be updated, which means they have a new version of their application running someplace if it gets deployed. So Ortelius and DeployHub is going to start tracking the version changes, the history in the catalog, and listen for where it's been deployed to, so you're tracking its inventory. So at any point in time, you understand, if you're a microservice developer and I'm going to release this, what's my blast radius? How many application teams consume this and what could happen? In Steve's first example, he talked about having a monolithic application that then you start bolting on microservices to it. Very common way for people to start building out microservices. That means that there probably is more coupling than in a true, purely microservice architecture where everything has been decomposed. In that kind of a situation, you still have the same kind of dependency requirements and challenges as you did in monolithic, except you're running the link step at runtime. So you really need to understand what that blast radius is. And what we're hearing from people who have really embraced microservice, and we're talking 4,000, 5,000 microservices, is they get collections of microservices that are not loosely coupled. They're tightly coupled, kind of like Steve's description of the database, create, read, update, delete. Those may have to be released at the same time, because a change in the table means that all of them have to be changed at the same time. So even though we have loosely coupled services, it does not eliminate the need to track how they're changing over time. And that is what I believe a lot of people don't understand about microservices. And in turn, that turns the microservices into a complex environment. Now, to get started, I'm going to leave it up to Steve to say what you probably need to get started with, how to learn Kubernetes, what needs to be installed, what are the basic things. I think he's better to answer those questions.
Yeah, so DeployHub was actually designed to deal with monolithic type of deployments to WebSphere. So originally it was designed to deploy your files to a WebSphere environment. But we saw early on as Kubernetes and was starting to gain traction that the concept of microservices fit really well with the containerizations and Kubernetes world. And as that started picking up, we added some features to DeployHub to deal with basically container management and container configuration management around that. So that's kind of the evolution that happened with DeployHub. So it'll actually support monolithic deployments to regular physical machines or to Kubernetes running in Azure. It doesn't really matter. One of the things that DeployHub does is abstracts out what we're deploying and what we're managing into what's called a component or a component version. That can be any size. It could be, a Lambda function. It could be a firewall rule. It could be a 5 gig WebLogic ear file. The size doesn't matter. What it is we know that we have a new version of this component. This new version of this component is related to this new version of the application. And because we made that link between the application and the component version, we know the blast radius, we know who the producers are, who the consumers are. You can look at your landscape, your map of your microservices from any viewpoint. You can look at it from a developer's viewpoint. What am I, an application developer? So I'm doing the front end. I can see what I'm consuming. You can look from the microservices developer, who's consuming me, the blast radius. You can look at it from the SRE or DevOps role. What is this? What's in this environment? How is this environment compared to a different environment? All that is tracked by Ortelius, and underneath all that, there is the deployment engine that is optional. You don't have to use the Ortelius or DeployHub deployment engine. Some of the advantages when you do use it is it understands how to do incremental deployments. So if you have 100 microservices, instead of deploying all 100 microservices all over again, you can deploy the 1 or 2 that have changed since the last time. Those type of things are what is under the covers in DeployHub and how we can manage that. Now, we'll fit into the pipeline process where there's Jenkins, Google Cloud Build, Circle CI. We have plugins into all those tools to make it as hands-off as possible. So the 3 steps that we want to capture are: when is a new component created, new version of the microservice? How does that roll up into a new version of the application? That's the second step. And then the last step is where was it deployed to? Did the DeployHub do the deployment? If it does, it automatically records the deployment. Otherwise, if you had like Spinnaker doing the deployment, we record that Spinnaker did the deployment to this environment. So those are like the 3 hooks, and out of that, you get this wealth of information that really allows you to understand what's happening, not only in production, but development, QA, across multiple teams, what's being shared where, how I can leverage all this information to make my, our goal as software developers is to get a change as quickly as possible out to the end user. And with DeployHub and Ortelius under the cover, in that process, we accelerate your time to market.
Yes, definitely. I think the one thing that we know every technology and every concept has some pros and cons in it. And one of the things that people talk about the microservices world, they say you distract and you decompose your application to microservices, now your time to market is going to be increased highly, or it's exponentially increased, because there are microservices, and these are the different microservices. Different teams have the responsibility to manage and deploy these kind of things. So they have to communicate with each other. Might be the communication takes time for them, and learning is also takes time for them. So I think that's a very good things that both of us, you talk about. So also, I think the one thing that I learned from over the years in the cloud native space, people are generating some projects and they define themselves in a way that this tool is doing these kind of things. But the end of the story is one of the great stories that we have other open source tool as well. So you can do all sort of another good things with this open source tool by integrating with some other open source tool. We have a very good story of the K3S, the Rancher deploy. One of the first things they deploy, this Rancher is a very fast one, is a lightweight one, and you spun up Kubernetes cluster in 190 or 60 seconds. But end of the day, there's so much happening right now in the Rancher community and these kind of things. You can do so many things that's not a target for the Rancher, but the community built those tools. And now everybody loving these kind of tools because you can integrate those kind of things and solve your problem with that. And I see the DeployHub in the same way. They have some common goals in ground they need to solve that every business is looking for. But they also have some integration point for that. If you need these kind of things has to be happening inside the DeployHub, you can build your own open source tool, integrate with the integration point with DeployHub. That's where your business and your open source is really effective in the way as well. So I think we have a very good technical discussion today, what the deep dive of microservices. Now let's switch to the community side as well. I think right now we have two communities that is very effectively. One of the larger communities called Cloud Native Computing Foundation. We see every cloud native project is going there. It's been acquired by or incubated by was a sandbox project, the CNCF. And for the last year, we see as Continuous Delivery Foundation came about, and they have also have some kind of foundation or funding for these open source projects as well. So can you, Tracy, tell our audience what where the DeployHub is at the moment? Is going to the CNCF side or the Continuous Delivery Foundation side, and why we want to use that route, where to look for the information for these open source projects? Could you go for the CNCF landscape or the Cloud Continuous Delivery Foundation landscape?
Well, the good news is that we're cross-pollinating. So DeployHub is a member of both the CNCF and the CDF. So you'll find us on both of their landscapes. You're right. It is a bit confusing because you have the CNCF has a whole CI group, an application delivery group. They are actually focused on a lot right now on the GitOps topic. They reached out to the folks at CodeFresh. Originally reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you think we should have this SIG in the CDF?" And I was hesitant because GitOps is really an operator. And in my opinion, the operator is really part of the cloud native side of the house. In other words, the operator should be a standard kind of object that everybody has in their cluster, right? It's part of the, in my world, it feels like part of the operating system. Whether it be, now there are things like Terraform that has, or HashiCorp that has their operator that has day one functionality, meaning it's more like an agent that lives outside of the cluster. But for GitOps, the GitOps operator is part of the operating system in my mind. So it makes sense for them to be focused on GitOps for the application delivery. We are starting to see tools like Captain, that's an event-based CI/CD system. They actually have joined the CD Foundation, and they are working on the events SIG. So, but they are incubating. Captain is a sandbox project in the CNCF. So we are just a family. Let's just think about it that way. The CNCF and the CDF is just a family. Maybe we'll see more of the CI/CD tools eventually come over and become members on the CDF side, instead of having themselves in the CNCF side because there wasn't a home for them, as you pointed out, not until a few years ago. So it's getting sorted out. But in terms of DeployHub, we definitely are squarely in the delivery pipeline. And Ortelius, while it's a microservice, it's serving a microservice user community. It is also, I would say it represents better the pipeline than it does the core of a cluster. It's not a rancher, right? It's not an operator. And important to think about is how the pipeline is changing to support hundreds of independently deployed services moving across the pipeline all day long. We're not going to talk about our door metrics in terms of we did a deployment once a day, we were doing really well. We're going to be thinking about releasing microservices all the time. It shouldn't be a once a day or once a week kind of event. It should be when it's ready to go. So the pipeline has to change, and Ortelius and DeployHub are helping drive how that pipeline is going to look different. And I always think of it as we're adding automated configuration management and cataloging to the pipeline because we no longer have a CI build step. So for creating software bill of material reports and difference reports and impact reports like we used to generate when we compiled and linked our code statically, Ortelius is adding some of that functionality into the pipeline for a microservice workflow.
Yes, definitely. And I think on top of that, we spoke about the CNCF, the CDF side as well. So if people go check out, if you want to know what are the talks happening in the KubeCon or the CDCon is also coming up, I think in June.
End of June.
Yes. And do we see people, some content from Ortelius community side in the CDCon side, or also do we see a sessions on where the question is where the session is happening regarding the microservices, specifically around the DeployHub side, is going to be happening on the CNCF KubeCon side, or the sessions are going to be held on the CDF or the CDCon side?
We'll be on CDCon. So as being a project, Ortelius, for all the projects, they recognize that they need to add a number of seats to CDCon for each of the projects because it is a project showcase. So you will have, there will be, I think that there's like 4 presentations around Ortelius at CDCon. We do have some of our committers submitting to KubeCon. KubeCon is a much harder stretch for us because we are not a humongous project. I mean, if we were as big as Jenkins or Spinnaker, we may have a better chance to get into KubeCon. But you never know. I've encouraged some of our younger, newer women to submit to KubeCon for the virtual side, because remember, KubeCon will be live this year, which unfortunately minimizes who can actually submit to talk, because you have to be there in person to do so. But they are going to do a hybrid event, so it's going to be virtual, and I've encouraged some of our members to go ahead and submit to KubeCon, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that at least one of us get accepted. We also will be presenting some sessions at DevOps World, which is, I can't remember when it is now. I think it's in September, but so look for Ortelius at DevOps World as well. Simon, I think you're frozen.
Yes, definitely. I think, and the next question for the Steve side as well. Oh, okay. So can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep.
Just, yeah. So I think the next question is from Steve's side as well, for the youngster who are just graduating from the university or the new software engineers. They're jumping into the cloud native and microservices space, and they want to contribute to the open source project. And let's say they have some passionate about microservices and these kind of domain-driven design and other kind of these activities. Can you suggest some pointers on how they can come into the Ortelius community and join the amazing microservices community and good colleagues around, and how they get start contributing to DeployHub and Ortelius side?
Sure. So one of the things that even, if you're a high school student or university or just graduated, doesn't really matter. Or if you're just want to, do a shift in your job, come join us. The easiest way to do it is to go to the Ortelius.io, and you'll see a section there, become a contributor, and it'll walk through what you need to do. As part of that, the quickest way is to get on our Discord channel, and there'll be links out there on our webpage on how to join the Discord channel. What we do at the Ortelius project, which is, I believe, different than some of the other open source projects, is we'll basically do like a mini chat to find out what your skill level is and where you want to be. And based on that, we will start working with you to assign issues, make sure you got your development environment up and going, and you'll get support not only from myself, but everybody that's in the community. Everybody is really willing to help out and get people started. We have people that have never coded before, that Ortelius was their first pull request ever. So, that's the level that we work at. And then we have people that have been doing, that are, SREs for, like Uber, that have been doing this forever. So the range of skill levels, we welcome everybody at that. And depending on what you're interested in, we have a couple different areas. We have the outreach area, which is, how do we get the community outreach going around blogs, our summit we just had, training tutorials, those type of thing, our badging system. And then you have the architecture side, which is more on the technical side, having to do with the coding. Typically, our new microservices that we're creating for Ortelius are in Python Flask, and they're literally less than 100 lines long. So we were trying to keep them small, follow the guidelines of microservices, and we'll pull that together. As part of the whole overall structure, everybody plays the role of a DevOps engineer or SRE. You get to follow your code all the way through, from where you create it to getting it to deploy to making sure it's running. You learn a little bit about everything as part of that process. We just had a group out of Africa called She Codes Africa. We had 2 mentees that we worked with for about 6 weeks, and they knew Python, but they didn't know anything about Docker or Kubernetes and doing cloud deployments to Kubernetes. And now they have that experience in the last 6 weeks. So that's just give you an idea of what we have going on with the project.
Yes, definitely. I think the one thing that I liked about open source project, especially the newcomers or the undergraduate students, is that, I think the microservices, Kubernetes, and Docker and container, these are the things that are going to be stay here for a very long time. And if you jump in early on this market, you have a very good opportunity to have a DevOps job, SRE role, and these kind of good roles have. If you're an undergraduate student and you want to keep up with the microservices and these kind of technologies, this community recognize your efforts, give you some contribution, that you're contributor of the month, other batches, some of the other programs they have, that lets you recognize to the whole open source communities that these are the people who contribute on a regular basis. And let's say if your contribution gets very heavily, and then bigger companies or bigger communities talk to you because you are the integral part of that open source project. I think that's the best thing with the open source you have. And also, I think that the community support, having the undergrad student, you need to have communication with some giants like Tracy and Steve, who have 20 or 15 years of experience. They give you the idea give you the mentor, what you need to do. And you ask question, what is a feasible career I am looking forward to? But the open source communities have so many benefits. These are the few things that I need to talk about and convince you to join these open source communities, because they are always welcoming, help you get up to speed. That's a part of the open source community, not having the just project running, just also need to learn, help educate people about these open source technologies and container technologies, so people get a good job and good feelings of in the next future. I think that's a really integral part of it. And if you don't know how to communicate with these guys, do send me a tweet at CloudNativeFM. I will help you get up to speed and track you onto the Ortelius community. And we're also doing some events as well. So you can join. We already have an event, Ortelius Microservices Vision. You can you can watch all those sessions. And we are talking about very few things about microservices, but the microservices visionary event having some very good details of what the microservices are, what their history is, and why people are talking about them, why there is so much noise in that area. That you go to the YouTube and search for Ortelius, I think you're able to find those sessions in a very detail. So I'll really learn a very good amount of detail of open source communities, how you contribute to open source, the technical aspect of also the CNCF, CDF side. I will remove many of the confusion from my side as well, because I already have those. And now let's the final thoughts. What is the next plan for the Ortelius and DeployHub? Moving to the next 6 months that we had, what you guys want to do, you get in the next 6 months of the 2021, and what are the broader goals of the DeployHub and Ortelius community?
Yeah, so let me just give you a quick update of where we're at with Ortelius and DeployHub. So we currently have a service catalog project in flight. I would say we're about halfway through it. That is going to add in additional metadata around the services, like who the service owner is, what's the developer Slack channel, what's the PagerDuty service link, those type of things. We're also adding in a way to bring in the CVEs and the licenses from the containers or the microservices. So that's the service catalog project that we have going on. Also in parallel, our Australian group is working on GitOps and how Ortelius can fit into the GitOps world. Right now, that's in the design and investigation stage. So hopefully the next month, they will be producing a white paper that will allow us to drive our next development project from there. So that's going to be kind of where we're at in the next 3 to 4 months as far as that. And then down the road, looking 6 months out, there's a concept of component sets. There's a scenario, this use case where we have tightly coupled components or microservices that have to move through the pipeline together. And we're going to be addressing that as well. So that's kind of like where we're headed in the next 3 to 6 months. Tracy, do you want to add anything on from the outreach side?
No, I think you covered it. What's most, I mean, we're going to be adding some, the ambassadors are going to be working on education material. We're starting to build a podcast. We'll do another Microservice Visionaries at the end of the year for our end of year celebration. And that was so much fun. It really was. We had people who were brand new, who had never presented before, took on these topics, that did the research and you know, put themselves out on a limb and went ahead and did the presentations. And I was proud of everybody. They did a great job. I'm hoping we want to do another one.
Yes, definitely. But thank you very much for explaining these concepts in my podcast. And hopefully everybody listening to us able to understand that microservices are going to stay here for a very long time. And this is the best time for you to jump into this world. And if you want to know how to jump into this world, search on the internet, ortelius.io, and go to the contributor guide, and you will join our Discord channel, and then we'll let you know what you need to do and how you contribute to these open source projects. We are looking forward for new contributors all over the world, and hopefully we find new and energetic, enthusiastic open source contributor. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge in my podcast and all these kind of details of microservices. And today I made a history, the first time the woman appeared on my CloudNative.fm podcast. I'm so excited. I'm so pumped up. Hope to see you again in future. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, if you want to keep up what's going on in the cloud native ecosystem, we have a weekly podcast show on YouTube and SoundCloud by the name of Cloud Native Islamabad. You can listen for free every single week. We try to find cloud and cloud native experts, share updates on cloud native best practices, cloud native real-world use cases, cloud native deployment patterns, cloud native deployment strategies. Topics include AKS on Azure, EKS on AWS, GKE on GCP, cloud native architectures, cloud native application developments, container containerizing application, DevOps and automation, cloud native certification strategies, cloud native career tips, and more. So if that sounds awesome to you, head over to the SoundCloud and YouTube and subscribe to Cloud Native Islamabad.